We want to thank Colgate, sponsors of NBC Western Theater and American Tobacco Company, sponsors of M Squad, for relinquishing their time tonight in order for us to bring you the following special program.
This is Wayne Ferris. I've just completed a 10,000-mile tour of the USSR. I traveled with Florida's Governor Leroy Collins and 8 other governors on a Red Star fact-finding tour of 5 of the 15 Soviet Socialist republics. Many of you heard my reports that were beamed from Moscow to Miami by radio through London and New York.
Presented in the interest of public information by the Commercial Bank of Miami in Edison Center and Merchants Bank of Miami on Red Road near the trail. At both Commercial and Merchants Banks, you will find big bank service with neighborhood convenience.
The Red Star is as symbolic of Russia as the hammer and sickle. It's the badge of the revolutionist, the anarchist, the radical. It's significant of revolutionary socialism and oppression. Reduced to its common denominator, the USSR is nothing more than a socialistic dictatorship. The governors and I hitched our wagon to what may well be termed a revolutionary tour that carried us into areas heretofore rarely open to foreigners. We moved from the Kremlin to Leningrad on the Baltic Sea, to Kiev in the Ukraine, to Tbilisi near the Turkish border, on to Tashkent and Samarkand, both ancient cities, and finally to Alma-Ata in Central Asia, only a mountain away from Red China. The height of the tour, of course, was an interview with the Red Star himself, Nikita Khrushchev. What did we see? What did we hear? And what do we think of Russia 1959? We'll have films of this strange country and some observations from both Governor Collins and myself in just a moment.
I just want to pause briefly to say Commercial Bank and Merchants Bank sincerely feel this is a great honor to bring this program to you in the public interest. I'm certain you'll find it informative and rewarding. Did you ever see a ruble? Well, if you lived in Russia, that is the type of currency that you would strive for in order to pay your rent and buy your daily bread. Now, later in the program, I'm going to introduce you to another member of our Russian entourage who has some interesting facts concerning the ruble. Right now, I'd like to remind you, if you live in or do business in the Northwest section, stop in at Commercial Bank in Edison Center. In the Southwest section, it's Merchants Bank on Red Road near the trail. At either bank, you'll find big bank service with neighborhood convenience.
The governor's tour of the Red Star Circuit comes at a time when both Russia and the United States are exchanging diplomatic and political figures in what can be compared to an old-time political campaign. This new Cold War weapon has everything, including the television debate. Governor Collins, as chairman of the National Governors Conference, headed our party, which included specialists in Russian affairs from the Institute of International Education, New York, and Columbia universities. The basic purpose of the governor's trip was to exchange information with the Soviet commissars on the handling of problems on a decentralized governmental level, problems ranging from atomic energy to the growth of citrus. In teaching, the governors absorbed. Governor Collins expressed his observations to President Eisenhower today, then flew to Miami this evening to join me and you Channel 7 viewers for a comprehensive report of our tour. Governor, welcome home.
Thank you, Wayne. It's good being home. We missed you up in Washington today.
I wish I could have made it.
You know, I think you and I both are going to have established some kind of record for air flying over this past month.
Well, that we did. 25,000 miles, 10,000 of it within the USSR.
Right.
And we're going to do some more flying now, but this time we'll be doing it on film, reliving the past here. Our flight by Air France to Moscow went smoothly enough, we were greeted at the airport by a Soviet delegation and our in-tourist guides, many of whom stayed with us throughout the trip. There was one thing most Americans would appreciate about Russia. One doesn't worry about his baggage. It usually winds up in your hotel room. We made the 45-minute trip to the Hotel Sovietskaya in Zims, Soviet limousines, about 2 years old and remarkable replicas of a 42 Buick. The Sovietskaya, by our standards, is far from luxurious, but it is airy, with ceilings 20 to 30 feet high, the ballroom 50 feet high. Service in the dining room is slow, with caviar almost becoming a staple in our diet. The governor's Fed got down to business on the second day when we met with the chairman of the Moscow Regional Soviet. It was here we were indoctrinated in decentralized Soviet government, where 99% of the people vote, but for one candidate. The Red Star tour in Leningrad shuttles us from meetings with Soviet leaders to museums and historic buildings. The Russians, ironically, are proud of their treasures, although they represent a past that the communists themselves buried. The Russians have done a remarkable rebuilding job. Leningrad lost 7,000 buildings during the war. Outside of Leningrad, we visited the summer palace of Peter the Great, where men, women, and children, and even the soldiers, enjoyed the scenic beauty. There's no doubt about it that communists have gone underground in a big way. Their subways are lavish, with marble columns and crystal chandeliers. And in keeping with their culture, the mosaic artwork is beautiful. Unlike New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, the Soviet subway is clean. One gets the idea that the place is being GI'd every minute of the day. The subway, like the machete to the Cuban, is the Soviet citizen symbol of the future. He can live better and certainly with more comfort in the subway than he can at home. Whether by intention or by necessity, Soviet subways are deep and would make luxurious bomb shelters. We rode one escalator to street level, easily the distance of a regulation football field. And when we weren't riding these subways, the in-tourist chauffeurs whipped us through the traffic at breakneck speed. They showed little regard for fellow motorists and even less for the pedestrians. It was fortunate that the traffic in Russia is light. Sometimes we thought we'd never get off of airplanes. We flew the red circuit in red jets, the equal of our own, on the outside. Inside, the comparison ended. But it was the DC-3 type aircraft the Russians apparently got on Lend-Lease that gave us the jitters, broken springs in the seats, slick tires, and open fields. The Russians love to sell you on boats, and aboard the larger crafts, you sail in 4 classes in this classless society. It's 2.5 hours by jet to Kiev, Russia's 3rd largest city and the capital of the Ukraine. This is the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, has a population of 1,200,000. Kiev, like Leningrad, suffered during the war with 43% of her buildings destroyed and 300,000 people killed. Governor Collins and I got a scenic view of the Dnieper River as we looked out over the Kiev Park and to the beaches. Kiev is one of the most picturesque cities in Russia. At least there's more greenery than in any other Soviet city we visited. And it seems that for every tree, there's a sign glorifying the Communist Party. I think Governor Collins will agree that the sign that tells the story in a nutshell is the one that read, "Long live communism, which is the pride of the happy future of the world." Kiev's future is in corn, wheat, sugar beets, strawberries, and livestock. We took time out for a brief shopping tour in Kiev, where the merchandise, as here in the United States, is displayed in the windows, but is comparatively drab. The governor purchased a blouse. And then at the hotel, it was a surprise birthday party for Governor Minor of New Jersey. It was his 51st. He was presented with a cake by the in-tourist guides, and Mrs. Minor provided the birthday kiss. Well, Russia's industrial capacity is expanding faster than we can think. Heavy industry gets priority. This explains why consumer goods are at a minimum. It's not because the Russians can't produce them. Goods are often beyond the reach of the average Russian. But the government doesn't ration. It merely prices them sky high. One of our guides happily noted that she was now able to purchase a watch for $50 American money. 3 years ago, that same watch would have cost her $150. We visited shops and factories, steel and cotton mills in several of the republics. We found, as expected, mostly women at work. An average worker earns $75 to $78 a month. The highest paid is $300 a month, which is the director's salary. 10% of the plant workers are members of the Communist Party, and so is the director. Soviet workers get a 12 to 24-day vacation yearly. In some instances, workers do earn more on a basis of the quality and quantity of their work. A capitalistic gimmick borrowed to spur the comrades toward a greater production. In Moscow, we visited an agricultural and industrial fair. On display are products that can be built today, but for the Russian, still years ahead. Why then such displays? Simply to inspire the worker to greater capacity with the idea that once the Soviet goal is accomplished, exciting consumer goods would go into production and be made available. Governor Collins, I'm certain, has some observation of his own on industry in Russia. Governor, as we look at these films and talk, do you agree that Russia is making great strides in industrialization?
There's no doubt about that, Wayne. And, of course, a totalitarian system lends itself very specifically to accomplish that. They've made remarkable strides in their industry, and I was amazed at the dispersal of that industry and the balance that they have achieved between industry and agriculture, for example. Every republic has its industrial development, and that industrial development usually is related specifically to the resources of that region. Now, in the great cotton-producing areas, for example, not only have they been interested in establishing an improved quality of cotton, but right next to that cotton, they've developed this tremendous textile mill, which ties in very specifically and gives them a fine balance.
Well, Governor, do you feel that perhaps we were taken to their finest factories rather than their most representative?
I think they showed us their best, of course. I think if we had them over here, we'd be inclined to do the same thing. But still, we've made it our business to go out of the way and off the beaten path to see as best we could just what they have.
Mm-hmm. Well, what did you think of this particular textile mill here? This one was in Tashkent, and you'll remember that as we went through and prior to going through, we learned that there were 17,000 people working in this factory.
Yes, it was an amazing thing. And I would take the judgment of Governor Hodges about that mill. Governor Hodges comes from North Carolina, where they have numerous textile industries, and he's a textile man by training and experience before he became governor. And he said to us that that's one of the finest engineered textile mills that he's ever seen.
There he is working the loom.
That's right.
He got a kick out of this trip.
Yes, he did. I started to grab hold of that thing, but I thought the second time and left it alone. I didn't know whether I'd leave any part of me there.
Well, do you think that you could compare these Soviet factories to the factories here in our country?
Some you could, many you couldn't. But there's no doubt about it, they've made remarkable progress when you take into account where they were before they started, which we have been a long ways ahead of them for a very long time.
Well, of course, they went into these areas that had no factories, had no schools, such as Tashkent and Samarkand. And since the revolution, they have given them these things. They've given the people work. They all now have ample to eat. And you can understand why, with having more today than they had yesterday, why these people believe in communism. This is that champagne factory.
I thought that was a very crude factory there. All of the work was done by hand, and even the labeling process looked very crude. In fact, we can find labeling machinery here in Florida where we can vegetables and fruits far superior to what we saw there.
These people always came up and greeted you warmly.
They certainly did. They certainly did. There's no doubt about it. There's a very basic feeling of friendliness among those people toward Americans.
Well, now, on this trip to Dubna, a short ride, or should I say about 2 hours, was it, from Moscow by car? It was the Atomic Energy Research Station.
Yes.
And after this session, then you toured the plant,
yes,
where they have the largest cyclotron in the world.
That's what they claim, and I don't know that we can refute that.
Well, what were your impressions of this plant?
Wayne, I had conflicting impressions about that. I was astounded as we approached the building that houses that remarkable piece of machinery, what a shabby condition the building itself was in. The exterior looked poor, the steps and the interior looked poor. The floor we were walking on was made of sheet steel that wasn't bolted down securely. It would buckle up under your feet. And yet there in the center was this perfectly magnificent plant that apparently had all the skill imaginable placed in its construction.
In the larger cities of Moscow and Leningrad, the Russians are building miles of apartment projects, each 5 to 8 stories high. Governor Clyde of Utah, a former civil engineer, pointed out basic structural flaws. We saw window panes cracking even before the buildings were completed. We were told that similar apartments were built for members of the U.S. Embassy but had to be evacuated less than 2 years after construction. The labor on these buildings could hardly be called skilled. We found elevators in some buildings with a capacity of only 5 people, including the operator. The governors and I were interested in what we might loosely refer to as the shopping centers in some of the projects. They're so large that it's necessary to provide stores. And each project has a nursery operated by the state. The toddlers are dumped into the nursery every morning while the parents go to work. Here they're fed and taught the party line. But children are children everywhere, and supervised play is part of the daily program. For certain, the youngsters are disciplined. They barely budged when we interrupted their rest period. These Russian youngsters and their parents are among the few who have apartments of their own. One retired school teacher we visited is proud of his living room, bedroom, kitchen, and bath. But in Tashkent and Samarkand, we found slums and hovels. Even in Moscow, we were told that some apartments are occupied by 2 families who are forced to sleep in shifts. Education is a fixation with the Russians. From 1917 until after the revolution, 80% of the adult population, and in some places as high as 98%, was illiterate. When Lenin took over, his first action was to separate the church from the state. He also said children should study in their own languages. So the USSR now teaches 43 languages. Governor, were you impressed with this Soviet educational system?
I was indeed impressed with the progress that they've made there with their educational system. I don't know that that's been duplicated in the history of mankind, where they've come from so far back, so far in such a short time. Of course, I can't think in terms of any application of that type of approach to education here, and we never could tolerate that sort of an approach. There, they're interested in developing a human being for what he can mean to the state. Here, we think in terms of developing a human being as a whole man, and what he can mean to society generally, and to himself, and to his family. And it's such a different concept that while you can't help but appreciate the efficiency of the job they're doing, still, it's not the kind of job that we would want to do.
Well, when we were in Moscow, the governor sat down with the Minister of Education, and he told us that after 1934, the Soviet government was determined to solve the problem of the required 7-year education for all. For until 1940, the Russians were unable to provide enough paper to publish the manuals, nor did they have enough teachers. The Russians are now working on a 10-year compulsory education. This is Moscow University, the most impressive and the largest of Soviet schools. Teachers up to the college level are paid according to their education and the number of lessons taught. They earn $71 to $78 a month and $93 after the first 10 years. Salaries go up 40% after 25 years. At the university, we talked with the rector, and we learned that teachers get fringe benefits ranging from a quarter acre of land to passes to rest homes. American students attend Moscow University. We talked with one of these students, Dick Judy.
Dick, I'm interested in knowing about the party line. Is that actually taught at the university?
Well, by this, I suppose you mean the Marxist-Leninist teachings. Yes, it is taught. Every student takes a course every year in the history of the Communist Party. All the students study dialectical materialism. all the students are required to study political economy. In the course of these three courses of study, of course, you get a good share of what's normally called the party line.
Well, how do the students, are they anxious in knowing about the United States? Do you have many discussions with these students?
Yes, I'd say there's a great deal of curiosity about the United States, about the West in general. These people, up until very recently, have had very little opportunity to know anything about the United States, about the West in general also, but particularly about the United States. They're very interested in our culture. They're very interested in jazz music. It enjoys a great popularity among the students here. They're interested in art, modern architecture, how we live, what sort of wages our workers earn, what all sorts of things cost. In short, there's an enormous curiosity about the United States.
Well, after these 10 months, are you anxious to get back home, or would you like to stay a little while longer?
Well, I'll certainly be very happy to get home. Of course, it'd be interesting to stick around here perhaps another year. I'm just at the point now where I feel like I'm beginning to understand this very strange country. But it's going to be awfully good to get home. There are so many things about this country, you know, that I don't think I get used to no matter how many years I lived here. It'll be nice to be able to read read the New York Times again for a change, or pick up, get a radio program that isn't full of fairly canned propaganda. So it'll be awfully good to get home.
With us on our Red Star tour was Professor Frank Traeger, director of New York University's Center of International Affairs Development. Together, we heard the Russians declare that for the first 8 grades, youngsters are prepared for productive labor, and for the next 3 years, they're trained in productive labor. Professor Traeger offered these observations about Soviet education.
One of the most striking things about the Soviet Union, which we have observed, is the close connection between the arms of government and the instruments of science and education. In city after city, county after county, republic after republic, engineers, economists, chemists, physicists, and other scientists were in the lead as prime ministers or leading officials of the country. They knew what they wanted. They had the base of knowledge for transforming what it is that they want into action. I suggest, at least to those of us in the United States who are concerned with both government and education, to hasten an ever more closer alliance between government and education. One of the things that I bring back from the Soviet Union, which confirms my own view, is the requirement that we get a bit tougher about our own elementary, secondary, and university education. For example, in Uzbekistan, they are now training teachers to begin the teaching of Oriental languages, which we always regard as being very hard, at the 6th grade. In the United States, we have just begun to experiment with the possibility of introducing European languages from the 6th grade. Nothing should prevent us from doing both. Children can learn at that age, as well as teenagers. And in conclusion, I would say, it is time for us to toughen up college entrance requirements and college requirements after entrance so as to achieve better scientists as well as better specialists even in the humanities.
The people's courts, on the surface, are not too unlike our own. Governor Collins and I had the opportunity to sit in on a divorce case. The judge, as in all Soviet trials, is assisted by 2 laymen who share equally in the decisions. That's our Ben Silver, who filmed the Red Star tour, standing at the right. The jurists are elected for 3 terms, and the defendant can select an attorney only after coming to trial. A copy of everything gathered by the prosecution is then turned over to the defense counsel. Governor, you're an attorney. What did you think of this Soviet legal system?
Well, I was impressed with one thing, that the average American lawyer going to the Soviet system certainly couldn't come back puffed up in respect to his profession, because they have little or no regard for the legal profession as such. I think they think of lawyers about as we would think of notaries public. Actually, the many safeguards that our system provides to protect the innocent are absent there. They do a cold-blooded, deliberate job of determining the facts, and you just don't have the operations of a courtroom like we're accustomed to them. The investigation is made before the trial. The judge actually determines the right or wrong before the trial. And then the man has his trial, and I don't know what his chances are of changing the judge's mind.
Then in the long run, they're a far cry from what we know as justice in the United States.
That's right.
Well, the people's people themselves, too, are a most interesting study in character. They're friendly in Moscow and Leningrad. They're even friendlier the further you get from both cities. You see more women than men in Russia. World War II took its toll. Soviet women dressed plainly, particularly in Moscow. There's more color in their dress in the various republics, depending on their history and tradition. This is the typical native costume in Tashkent. Soviet soldiers wear baggy dress, although when on duty in Red Square or other important posts, they're usually groomed to perfection. The governors took every opportunity to greet and talk by interpreter to the man on the street. Russia's women have suffrage, and they pay for it with work. Women work in the shops, and they work alongside their men in the fields and the steel mills. You name the job, and you'll find them doing it. This is a woman's country. You'll find few who wear lipstick or visit a beauty parlor. Those who do usually come out with a kinky wave. Will the Soviet people always work so hard? The Russians are looking forward to the promised 6-hour workday that will eventually, they say, go to a 4-hour day. But Soviet leaders note that spare time hours will not be wasted, as one put it, in bar rooms as they do in the United States. Consequently, the shorter day will have to wait until the people's people can be properly educated into how they use their spare time, as the Russians put it.